The dust moved before the wind did. That was the first thing wrong. In Oak Haven, Nebraska, you learned to read the sky the way other people read clocks. The color of the horizon at 4 in the afternoon, the direction the crows flew before a storm, the way cattle pressed themselves against the north fence when something electric moved through the air. Martha Vance had read that sky for 64 years. She knew every shade of amber, every bruised purple, every sick yellow-green that preceded disaster. But the dust that evening moved wrong. It rolled toward her from the south pasture, not in a wave, not in the wall she had learned to recognize, but in a slow, deliberate curl, like something enormous breathing on the other side of the ridge. Martha stood on her porch and watched it come. She did not go inside. Before we go any further, stop for a second. You are about to hear the story of a woman who made one quiet, private decision on a desperate night. A decision that cost her nothing more than a bucket of water and a handful of silage. And that single act of mercy brought 200 men to her door the very next morning, armed and furious, wanting something she had not even known she possessed. Here is what I want to ask you. Have you ever done something good, something small and honest and right, and had the world punish you for it? Leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from today. And if you believe that kindness still has power in a world that has forgotten it, press that like button before this story ends. Because Martha Vance is about to prove something. Stay with her. She is worth it. The county of Oak Haven in the summer of that third dry year looked less like a place and more like a wound. The creek beds had cracked into tile patterns, each hexagonal piece of clay curled at the edges like old photographs left too long in the sun. The cottonwood trees along the south fence line had stopped shedding leaves because there were no leaves left worth shedding. Just pale, brittle branches that clicked against each other in the hot wind like the teeth of something long dead. The grass, what anyone still called grass, was the color of cigarette ash, flat and fine and drifting, and when you walked through it your boots raised small pale clouds that hung in the still air long after you had passed. 3 years without a real rain. 3 years of watching the county assessor drive slowly past the fence lines with his clipboard and his careful, neutral expression. 3 years of watching the Delacroix family load their furniture into a U-Haul in February, and the Whitfields in April, and the Garner brothers in June. 3 years of watching Oak Haven become a place that people left. Martha Vance had not left. Her property, 412 acres that her husband Roy had mortgaged twice and paid off once before his heart gave out 11 years ago, sat at the western edge of the county, where the land rose slightly before flattening into the long, featureless plain that the locals had always called the Sea of Grass. It was not much of a sea anymore. It was barely a pond. But Martha stayed. She was a woman who had pared herself down to essentials over the years, the way a knife blade is pared, not diminished, but sharpened. At 64, her hands were a document of everything she had ever done. The rope-burn scars from the old pulley on the well, the faded white line along her left palm from the Harrow accident in 1998, the permanently darkened knuckles from decades of soil. Her hair was silver and pulled back without ceremony. Her eyes were the pale gray of winter sky over the flats, and they had the quality of eyes that had stopped being surprised by pain, but had not stopped registering it. She kept 12 chickens, a pair of aging draft horses named Clement and Duchess, and a garden that she irrigated by hand from a cistern fed by a single working well. She had a truck that ran when the weather agreed with it, a root cellar with enough preserved food to see her through winter, and a radio. She had not owned a television since 2019, when the satellite dish had blown off the roof, and she had decided not to replace it. What she also had, though few people in town knew it, was debt. Not the catastrophic kind, Roy's kind, the kind that could swallow a man whole, but a slow, patient debt, the kind that waited. The property taxes on 412 acres of nearly worthless drought-dead land were still assessed at pre-drought values, a fact that the county had not seen fit to correct and that Martha had not had the money or the energy to fight. She had 3 months of arrears. She had no plan. She had the land and the house and the radio and the horses and 12 chickens. And she had one thing more, one thing she had not told anyone about. Not the bank and not the county assessor and not the minister at the Baptist church in town who brought her meals sometimes and looked at her with that particular kind of pity she could not stand. In the top drawer of the oak dresser in her bedroom, beneath a folded flannel shirt that had been Roy's, there was an envelope. The envelope was sealed. It had been sealed for 4 years. The return address was a hospital in Omaha, and the handwriting on the front, her name, her address, written in the careful block letters of a man who had learned to write left-handed after an accident, was the handwriting of her son. Daniel Vance had gone to Omaha 8 years ago to work in a manufacturing plant. He had gone because the farm was failing even before the drought, because the price of corn had collapsed and the price of fuel had not, because he was 26 and strong and had told his mother he would be back in 2 years with enough money to clear the last of the debt and fix the north irrigation system. He had said it the way young men say things, with absolute certainty, with the particular confidence of someone who has not yet learned how wrong certainty can be. He had died in an industrial accident 14 months later. A loading crane, a cable, a moment of mechanical failure that the plant's lawyers had described in their letter as a regrettable incident. Martha had received 2 letters, one from the lawyers, one from Daniel, mailed the day before he died, that she had opened halfway and then sealed again when she saw the first 3 words. She had not been able to finish it since. She told herself she was protecting herself. She told herself she would open it when she was ready. She told herself a great many things in the dark hours after 2 in the morning when she sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, listening to the nothing sounds of the empty house. The truth was simpler and harder. She was afraid of what it said. She was afraid it would be forgiveness she had not earned. She was afraid it would be a need she had not answered. She was afraid that whatever Daniel had written in those last hours would be the exact shape of the thing she had failed to do. So the envelope stayed in the drawer, and Martha stayed on the land, and the drought stayed, patient and absolute, over everything. On the evening of the 4th of August, the temperature had been 104 degrees by noon and had not dropped meaningfully by 5. The sky to the south was the color of old brass. Martha had finished her evening rounds, water for the horses, feed for the chickens, a slow walk of the fence line with the old shepherd's crook she used as a walking stick, and had come back to the porch to sit in the one chair that still had all 4 legs. She was not watching for anything. She was simply watching, the way she always did, the way the land required. The dust curled toward her from the south, moving wrong. And then she heard it. Beneath the wind, beneath the dry clicking of the dead cottonwoods, beneath the faint moan of the empty wire fence. A sound so low and desperate it was almost not a sound at all. It was the sound of something giving up. Martha stood. She picked up her crook. She walked toward the south pasture, into the dust, without a flashlight, because she knew this land the way she knew her own breathing. She found the animal 30 yards from the cellar door, collapsed against the base of the old stone fence that had once separated her property from the Delacroix place. She almost missed it in the dusk. The animal was the color of dried earth, a dull, burnt roan, matted and collapsed, barely distinguishable from the cracked ground beneath it. It was only the white of one eye, catching the last gray light, that stopped her. Martha crouched. Not quickly. Her knees did not allow quickly anymore, but with the careful, deliberate movement of a woman who had learned that startled creature's bite. It was a cow, a heifer by the looks of her, though it was hard to be certain because there was so little of her left to examine with confidence. The bones were visible in a way that was almost architectural. The ridge of the spine, the fan of the ribs, the sharp angles of the hip points pressing against hide that had gone dull and papery with dehydration. There were burns on the animal's left flank, faded but unmistakable, the particular pattern of chemical or heat exposure that left the hair gone and the skin beneath a waxy, damaged pink. Around the burns, someone had attempted to apply something, a salve, perhaps, long dried and cracked now, that had not been enough. In the animal's left ear, clipped with the kind of metal applicator used at commercial operations, was a brindle metal tag. Round, not rectangular. Old enough to have rusted at the edges. On its face, stamped rather than printed, was a single numeral. 0. Martha looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the animal's eye again, white-rimmed and sunk deep in its socket, filmed with dust, but open. Watching her, she straightened. She turned back toward the house. She had, in the cellar, 1 full bucket of clean water from the morning's draw, water she had intended to use for tomorrow's garden. She had, in the far corner of the old equipment barn, a bin of silage she had not opened in over a year. Roy had packed it in the last good season, vacuum sealed in the way he had learned from an agricultural extension pamphlet, tight and preserved. She had kept it because getting rid of it had felt like admitting something she was not ready to admit. She had not opened it because opening it felt like using the last of him for something ordinary. She went to the cellar first. She carried the bucket out across the dark yard, moving carefully, both hands on the wire handle, feeling the weight of the water shift with each step. The wind had picked up. The dust moved sideways now. She could taste the alkaline bite of dry Nebraska topsoil at the back of her throat, that particular flavor she had grown up tasting and had never learned to love. The animal had not moved. Its breathing was audible now that she was close. A shallow, rapid labor, each exhale accompanied by a faint vibration in the nostrils, like the last flutter of something mechanical winding down. Martha set the bucket down within reach of the animal's nose. She did not force it. She waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. The cow's eye tracked her, but the neck did not move. Then, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, the head shifted. The muzzle touched the water. The first drink was tentative, a lip barely dipped, then withdrawn, as if the animal was no longer certain it was allowed to want things. Martha sat down on the ground beside her. The dust and the hardness of the earth did not matter. She sat with her back against the stone fence and she waited, and the animal drank. Slowly at first, then less slowly. Not greedily. There was not the strength for greed, but steadily, with a kind of grateful determination. When the bucket was half empty, Martha stood, went back to the barn, and levered open the silage bin. The smell hit her like a physical thing. Fermented corn, molasses, the particular sweet-sour density of preserved feed. Roy's smell, his hands in the mix, his care in the packing, his attention to the ceiling. She stood at the open bin for a moment with her hand on the rim, not moving, not allowing herself to move until the feeling passed. It passed. She took a coffee can from the shelf above the bin and filled it. She brought the silage to the animal in small portions, the way you feed something that has been starved. Not a flood, but a trickle, given slowly enough for the body to remember how to receive it. The animal ate. Between each small offering, Martha waited, her hand resting lightly on the animal's neck, not petting exactly, just present, steadying, the way you sit with someone who is frightened in the dark. She cleaned the burns with the last of the antiseptic from the medicine cabinet, the brown bottle, half empty, that she had been rationing for months. She tore a strip of clean cloth from an old shirt of Roy's she had been meaning to cut into rags and laid it loosely over the worst of the damaged skin, not bandaging it tight, just protecting it from the dust. The wind was bad by then. The dust storm had fully arrived, a low, dense wall of it that reduced visibility to 20 feet and coated everything. The fence, the barn walls, the backs of Martha's hands, in a fine reddish-tan film. She could feel it in her teeth. She dragged the animal, with enormous effort and the help of a coil of rope looped under the chest, the 30 yards to the equipment barn. The cow resisted at first. The effort of rising was visible in every muscle, but then stood, trembling, and allowed herself to be led. Martha closed the barn doors against the storm. She brought her lantern from the house. She bedded the animal down in the clean corner of the barn that had held Roy's old equipment, the corner she had swept and swept again over the years, keeping it clean for no particular reason she could have named. She sat with the animal until its breathing slowed from that shallow, desperate flutter into something quieter, something more considered, until the eye, no longer white-rimmed, closed. Martha turned down the lantern. She sat in the near dark with the smell of preserved feed and dust and antiseptic and the animal's warm, slow breathing, and she did not think about the water she had used or the silage she had opened or the medicine she had spent. She thought about an eye watching her from the dust, uncertain whether it was still allowed to want. She thought about Daniel. She blew out the lantern and walked back to the house in the dark, hands trailing along the fence wire to guide herself, the storm still pressing hard against everything. She did not open the dresser drawer, but she thought about it for a long time before sleep finally came. She woke to engines. Not one, not two. The plural was useless. It was a sound beyond counting, a low mechanical thunder that pressed through the walls of the house and sat on her chest before she had fully come awake. She lay in the gray pre-dawn light for a moment, listening, trying to sort it into something reasonable. A convoy, a highway project, something passing through. But the sound was not passing. It was gathering. Martha got up. She did not dress with ceremony. She pulled on her work pants, her boots, buttoned her flannel shirt, the same one she wore every morning, and went to the front door. She opened it. The world outside was so changed that for a moment she could not make sense of what she was looking at. They stretched from the end of her gravel drive all the way to the county road and beyond. Trucks and old pickups and ATVs and 2 horses, and between and behind them, on foot, an arrangement of human bodies so dense that the early light had trouble finding the spaces between them. 200 men, perhaps more. She could not count them. The mass was too solid, too purposeful, too pointed directly at her front porch. Some carried rifles, not raised, not yet, but carried, slung, or held loosely in the way men carry tools when they are doing something they have decided is work. Some held signs, though from this distance she could not read the lettering. The signs were not organized, not matching, not a march. This was not a march. This was a convergence. People who had all decided to go to the same place and had all arrived. At the front of them, seated in a county cruiser parked at the edge of her yard, door open, one boot on the gravel, was Sheriff Alfie Sterling. Alfie Sterling was 68 years old and had been sheriff of Oakhaven County for 19 of them. He was a large man who had once been powerful and was now simply large, the kind of large that takes up space without filling it. His face was weathered in the way of men who have spent a great deal of time outdoors and very little of it enjoying the experience. Furrowed, sun-dried, permanently compressed into an expression that could pass for authority from a distance and revealed itself as exhaustion up close. Martha had known Alfie Sterling since they were both in grade school. She had watched him, over 2 decades, become slowly wrong in the way that comfortable men become wrong. Not through any single decision, but through a long, quiet series of small accommodations until one day you looked at them and realized the man you had known was still in there somewhere, but was no longer making the decisions. He got out of the cruiser when he saw her on the porch. He walked toward her with his hands in his jacket pockets. Not threatening, not friendly, the particular neutral presentation of a man who has rehearsed this moment. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. Behind him, 200 people said nothing. The engines had cut. The silence was enormous. Alfie looked up at her. Martha looked down at him. He said, finally, "Martha." She said nothing. He said, "We have a situation here." She waited. He said, "There is a report of stolen livestock on your property. I am going to need you to come on out here and let me do my job." Martha turned her head slightly and looked at the 200 people standing on and around and behind her land, and then she looked back at Alfie. She said, "That is a lot of people for a livestock report." And Alfie Sterling's face, just for a second, just for a fraction of a second, showed something underneath the neutral presentation. Something she had not seen on his face before. Not guilt exactly. Something colder. Something that had already made its calculations and was simply executing. She did not go inside. She did not step off the porch. She held the door frame with one hand and looked out at the mass of people, and she took inventory the way Roy had taught her to take inventory. Calmly, systematically, starting at the edges and working inward. At the left flank of the crowd, she could see the Whitmore brothers, Eldon and Cal, who had lost their upper pasture in the second dry year and had been doing day labor at the feedlot since. Their faces were tight and unreadable, the particular expression of men who have committed to something in the dark and are finding it less comfortable in the light. Next to them, Lou and Ferris, whose husband Pete had died of a stroke in February. Likely from the stress, the doctor in town had said, with careful imprecision. Lou had her arms folded and was not looking at Martha. That was the thing Martha noticed most about Lou, and she was not looking at her. In the middle of the crowd, at a height that made him visible above the others, was Judd Harrison. Judd was 51. He had farmed 600 acres southeast of town with a precision and intelligence that had made him something of a local legend. The man who had kept his operation in the black through 2 bad seasons in the 90s, who had diversified into specialty crops when everyone else doubled down on corn, who had been the informal advisor to half a dozen smaller farms around the county. He had also been Roy's friend, once. Martha remembered him younger, at her kitchen table, arguing with Roy about commodity futures while she brought them coffee she did not drink herself. The drought had broken him differently than it had broken others. Not all at once. Slowly. And there was something particular about watching a precise, careful man come apart slowly. It was like watching a fine instrument degrade. By the time he had lost the last of the specialty crop operation, Judd Harrison was something Martha did not quite recognize. Still capable, still organized, but pointed in a direction she would not have predicted. He stood in the crowd now with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his jaw set and his eyes on the barn. Just the barn. Not her. The barn. That told her everything she needed to know about the nature of this particular morning. Alfie Sterling had come back to the foot of the steps. He was using his official voice now, the one pitch to carry without quite being loud enough to be recorded as shouting. He said, "Martha, I have received a formal complaint from 3 separate property owners that an animal matching the description of one that went missing from the Keller operation last spring was seen being led onto this property last night. Now I am not saying you took anything. I am saying I need to verify. The law is the law even for people I have known a long time." She said, "The Keller operation went under in March. There is nobody at the Keller place to file a complaint." Alfie said, "The complaint was filed by representatives of the estate." She said, "What estate?" He said, "Martha, I am asking you nicely to cooperate." She studied him, the practiced neutrality of his face, the way he had positioned his body between her and the crowd, which could read either as protection or as theater, and which she was increasingly certain was theater. She said, "Who are the representatives of the Keller estate, Alfie?" Something moved in his face. Gone in an instant. He said, "That is not relevant to the matter at hand." She looked past him at the crowd. 200 people. 190 of them she had known for decades, had attended their children's baptisms, had brought casseroles to their houses when they were ill, had waved at them from truck windows on the county roads for 40 years. Most of them were not looking at her with hatred. Most of them were looking at her with something she recognized and feared far more than hatred. They were looking at her with the flat, determined expression of people who have made a calculation that survival requires. They did not want to be here. They wanted to not be starving. Those were not the same thing, but the distance between them had been compressed, carefully and deliberately, into something that felt like the same thing. Judd Harrison had not moved. His eyes were still on the barn. Alfie cleared his throat. He said, "I am going to give you a simple choice, Martha, and I want you to hear me out before you respond." He paused. He looked down at his boot, then back up. He said, "You can confirm that the animal on your property is one you found on open land, in which case it would be considered abandoned property and subject to county ordinance for disposition, which means it goes to the community for equitable distribution. Or," he paused again. The crowd was absolutely still. He said, "You can insist it is yours, in which case I am going to need to see documentation. And if you cannot produce documentation in the next 20 minutes, I am going to have to treat that as evidence of unlawful possession, which carries consequences for your property rights here." The silence after he finished was the particular silence of something that has been rehearsed. The words had been chosen carefully. Every exit had been closed before she arrived at it. She understood, standing on her porch in the early gray light, that she was meant to have no good choices. That the purpose of this morning was not to recover livestock, but to produce a documented justification, one that would hold up in front of a federal oversight body for what came next. The land. Not the cow. The land. She said, "Alfie, what is the name of the corporation that wants to buy this valley?" The silence changed. Something shifted in the crowd. She could feel it even though she could not see faces clearly. A ripple. Alfie said nothing. His jaw had tightened. She said, "I will take that as a confirmation that we have both understood each other correctly." She turned and went back inside and locked the door. She went to the barn first, through the back door of the house, across the yard, moving quickly but not running, because she did not run anymore unless she had to, and she was not certain yet whether she had to. The animal was awake, lying still but with its eyes open, both of them now, tracking Martha as she came through the barn door. The breathing had normalized, not strong, not what she would call healthy, but rhythmic. The silage had done its work. Martha crouched beside the animal and looked at the brinco in the ear. 0. She had seen tags like this before. Not often. They were not common in commercial operations. But Roy had attended an agricultural extension conference in Lincoln in 2009 and had come back talking, with the particular excitement he reserved for things he did not quite understand but wanted to, about a genetics program being run out of a university-affiliated research facility near Scottsbluff. Something about drought resistance. Something about a closed breeding line they were developing from heritage stock. He had talked about it for a week, and then the subject had faded, as most things did that were not immediately practical. She had paid only half attention at the time. She paid full attention now. The tag style, round, single-digit, stamped rather than printed, matched what Roy had described. The research facility had used a closed numbering system for its foundational genetic stock. Single digits for the original matrices. The animals that were not bred for sale, but for preservation of the line. If this animal was who the tag said she was. Martha sat back on her heels. If this animal was foundational stock from a closed research line, the data encoded in her genetics was not a commodity. It was a scientific resource. It was the kind of thing that research institutions paid lawyers to argue about, and that agricultural corporations paid considerably more to control. And it was sitting in her barn. She heard the sound of truck doors opening outside. The crowd had started to move. She heard Alfie's voice, amplified now. He had brought a bullhorn, telling the crowd to hold their positions. She heard Judd Harrison's voice, lower, closer, saying something she could not make out. She looked at the animal again. The animal looked back at her. Martha went to the old workbench along the back wall of the barn. Beneath the bench, behind a stack of feed sacks, was the radio, Roy's amateur radio set, the one he had used to talk to other farm operators across the region during the flooding years in the 90s, when phone lines went down and the CB channels were jammed. She had maintained it the way she maintained everything Roy had left her, not from any particular plan, but because she could not bring herself not to. She dusted it. She checked the battery backup once a month. She had never transmitted on it herself. She had the frequency of the Oak Haven Agricultural Emergency channel memorized. Roy had made her memorize it the same way he had made her memorize the locations of the fire extinguishers and the first aid kit. Without urgency, without drama, as a simple practical fact she might one day need. She turned the set on. The warm electronic hum filled the barn. She did not transmit yet. She went to the barn door and opened it a crack. Judd Harrison was 40 feet away, walking toward the barn, and he was not alone. There were 6 men with Judd, and they moved with the particular organization of men who had divided a task among themselves in advance. 2 went to the left side of the barn, 2 to the right. 1 took a position at the corner, facing back toward the house. 1 stayed at Judd's shoulder. Judd himself stopped 10 feet from the barn door. He had a bolt cutter hanging from his right hand. Not threateningly, practically. The way you carry a tool to a job. He said, "Martha." She was still behind the barn door. Through the crack she could see his face clearly, the specific gravity of it, the way the jaw was set and the eyes were quiet. Judd Harrison in the grip of a decision already made. She said, "Judd," he said, "I am not going to apologize to you for being here. I have got a daughter at home who ate ketchup packets for dinner last week because that was what was in the house. I am not apologizing for her." She said, "I am not asking you to." He said, "Then open the door." She said, "No." The bolt cutter swung in his hand, not toward anything, just moved. A reflex. He said, "Martha, you know what is in there. You have been walking around all morning like you know. And if you know what it is worth to the people in this county who are about to lose everything, then you know that what you are doing right now is not kindness. What you are doing right now is one woman deciding that her conscience is worth more than 100 families." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is not what I am doing." He said, "Then tell me what you are doing." She said, "I am thinking." He made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a dismissal, something between them. He said, "You have got about 15 minutes before this crowd stops listening to Alfie and starts making decisions on its own. I have seen how these things go, Martha. I have been in front of angry people before. You do not want to see what comes after the point where the crowd stops listening." She said, "Who told you about the tag, Judd?" The question landed. She could see it in the small stiffening of his posture, the way his chin came up slightly, the specific reaction of a man who has been asked the right question from an unexpected direction. He said, "That is not." She said, "Who told you a cow with a 0 tag was worth what you are here to collect this morning?" He said, "That is not relevant." She said, "Everything is relevant, Judd. That is the problem. Everything is always relevant, and we only understand it after." He was quiet. The man at his shoulder said something low that she could not hear. Judd raised one hand slightly, a small gesture, a hold, and the man went quiet again. He said, "The corporation, the people who want to buy in this county, They came to several of us last spring. Said they were interested in land consolidation. Said they would pay fair value. He paused. Said fair value was significantly above what the county assessor had the land at, given the drought. She said, and he said, and they mentioned that there was a specific biological asset that was known to still be in the region. An animal from the Scottsbluff research program that had dispersed when the facility went bankrupt. They said if the asset was recovered and transferred to their research division, the compensation for the county's participating landowners would be significant. He said the last word with a particular carefulness, the way you handle something delicate because you know it is delicate and are trying not to let anyone see your hands shaking. She said, and what did they want done with the animal? A pause, longer than the others. He said, the asset transfer protocol required the animal to be euthanized for tissue sampling. The genetics are what they want, not the animal. The barn was quiet behind her. The animal had not moved, but Martha could feel her breathing, the slow, steady rhythm of it, the barely recovered life of it. She said, they want her dead. He said nothing. She said, they told you she had to die for you to get paid. And you came here at dawn with 200 people to make sure that happened. To an animal that walked into my yard half dead and drank my last bucket of clean water. He said, Martha. She said, who is the estate representative who filed the complaint with Alfie? Another pause. This one had a different quality. He said, it was a legal entity. A holding company. I do not know the full corporate structure. She said, but Alfie knows. He did not answer. That was its own answer. She said, go back to the crowd, Judd. I need time. He said, you do not have time. She said, I know. Go anyway. He looked at the barn door for a moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the crowd, the bolt cutter still hanging from his hand, and the 6 men fell in behind him without a word. Martha closed the barn door. She went back to the radio. She sat down on the stool in front of Roy's workbench and looked at the set for a moment. Then she looked at the animal. The animal was watching her with that steady, quiet attention, not afraid now, just present, just waiting. Martha thought, she trusted me. She thought, 1 bucket of water. That was all it took. 1 bucket of water, and she trusted me. And now 200 people want her dead, and the man who is supposed to protect this county is on their payroll. She thought, Daniel, I understand something now that I did not understand before. She turned back to the radio. She began to transmit. Alfie Sterling's voice came through the barn walls before the bullhorn clicked off, that particular electronic flatness of amplified sound losing its last energy. He said, Martha Vance, I am giving you a final opportunity to open those barn doors voluntarily before I am compelled to authorize entry as a matter of public safety and property law. She kept the radio frequency open and the transmit key depressed. She said into the microphone, my name is Martha Vance. I farm 412 acres at the western edge of Oakhaven County, Nebraska. I am broadcasting on the Oakhaven Agricultural Emergency Channel. I am requesting that any licensed journalist, agricultural regulatory body, or law enforcement agency above the county level who receives this transmission contact my location by any available means. What I am about to describe is not a property dispute. She paused. She breathed. She kept going. She said, last night, I found a malnourished animal on my property during the dust storm. I gave it water and feed and medical attention. This morning, I woke to 200 armed men on my land. The animal bears a single-digit identifying tag consistent with foundational genetic stock from the Scottsbluff Experimental Agricultural Research Program that was dissolved in bankruptcy in 2021. A corporate entity, operating through what I believe is a fraudulent estate complaint filed through my county sheriff, has organized the men of this county around a promise of financial compensation contingent on the death of this animal so that its genetic material can be harvested. She stopped. She listened. Through the barn walls, she could hear the crowd, the particular low, formless sound of a large group of people who have been waiting a long time and are no longer certain what they are waiting for. She said, the men outside this barn are not criminals. They are farmers who have lost everything in 3 years of drought. They have been offered survival in exchange for something that looks, from the outside, like a reasonable trade. What they do not know is that the corporation that approached them does not intend to pay fair value for their land. It intends to acquire the entire valley for a fraction of its long-term worth using the environmental disruption of the drought as cover. The animal is not incidental to this plan. It is the mechanism. By organizing the county around the value of this one animal, the corporation has created a conflict that will generate documented legal justification for land seizure and consolidation. She released the transmit key. The silence on the channel felt enormous. Then she set the key down and turned to look at the animal. The animal was on her feet, not steady, still trembling slightly at the hindquarters, but up, standing in the clean corner of Roy's old barn with her ears forward, watching Martha with both dark eyes. Martha walked to her. She stood beside her with one hand on the animal's neck, feeling the warmth of her, the pulse of her, the improbable, recovered reality of her, and she stood there for a moment and let herself feel the weight of what she had just done. She had accused the county sheriff of corruption on an open frequency. She had told the entire county that the men who had come to her property this morning were being used. She had no evidence beyond the conversation with Judd, the tag in the animal's ear, and the story that Roy had come home from Lincoln with 15 years ago. She had no documentation. She had no lawyer. She had a radio, a barn, a dying truck, 3 months of back taxes, and a cow. She had done it anyway. She thought about that. About why she had done it anyway. About the exact moment she had decided. It had been when Judd said, the asset transfer protocol required the animal to be euthanized. That was when she had stopped thinking about her land and her taxes and her position and had started thinking about something else entirely. About the way the animal had looked at her in the dust the night before. About what it meant that I washed you from the dark and waited to see if you were the kind of person who would still help. She had passed that test, in the dark, without anyone watching. She was not going to fail it in the daylight with 200 people watching. But she was frightened. She would not lie to herself about that. Her hands on the animal's neck were not entirely steady. The radio transmission had gone out into a silence that might be absolute. It was possible no one with any authority to help her had been monitoring that frequency. It was possible she had made everything worse. It was possible she was going to lose the land, and the barn, and the animal, everything that remained of the life she had built with Roy, because she had poured a bucket of water in the dark. She closed her eyes. She thought, Daniel, I do not know if I am doing this right. She thought, I do not know if there is a right. I know that it is what I am. She opened her eyes. The animal stood beside her, breathing, warm and present and alive. Then she went to the back corner of the barn where she kept her tools, and she climbed up onto Roy's old tractor. The tractor started on the third crank. The engine sound filled the barn, shook the walls, and she felt the crowd outside go still. She could feel it through the metal frame, through the vibration of the machine itself. The sound of the crowd silence was almost louder than the engine. She drove it to the barn doors. Not through them. She positioned the tractor's front loader at the interior of the barn door, blocking it from the inside. The blade raised slightly. The machine parked solid and heavy and immovable unless you had something bigger than the Harrison family's aging John Deere. She climbed down from the seat. She went back to the radio. She said, I want to address the people outside this barn directly. I know most of you. I have known most of you for 40 years or more. I know what this drought has cost you. I know it has cost some of you everything. I know that when someone offers you a way out, even a hard way, even a way you might not choose in better times, you take it because your children are eating ketchup from packets, and you are 2 months from losing your land, and you cannot see another road. She took a breath. She said, Alfie Sterling has a document he showed to at least 3 of you. It is an estate complaint on behalf of the Keller property. I am asking you, right now, this morning, to ask him who filed that complaint. Not the name of the estate. The name of the individual who filed it. The natural person behind the corporate entity. Ask him that question and watch his face when he answers it. She released the key. Outside, the sound of the crowd changed. It was subtle, not an eruption, not the dramatic shift that happened in the movies. Just a change in quality, like the difference in the sound of a river before and after a stone is dropped into it. A slight, spreading alteration. She heard Alfie's voice, not amplified now, speaking to someone near the cruiser. The words were not clear, but the tone was a controlled urgency, the voice of a man who is managing something that has just gotten harder to manage. She heard Judd Harrison's voice, louder, directed not at her, but at the crowd. And what he said she could make out clearly because the words had a carrying quality that surprised her. He said, Who is the named individual, Alfie? Just give us the name. Silence. Then Alfie's voice again. And this time, even without the words, she could hear the shape of evasion in it, the particular rhythm of someone producing a technically accurate non-answer. The crowd sound changed again. Martha held the transmit key down one more time. She said, "There is a number I want to read to you. It is a tag number. It identifies this animal as a specific genetic matrix from the Scottsbluff Agricultural Research Program. Protocol number 7-44, Foundational Breeding Stock." The program was funded partly by USDA Rural Agricultural Preservation grants. That means the genetic material in this animal has a federal protection interest. The corporation that wants to buy this valley cannot legally take this animal and cannot legally destroy it without a federal permit. They have no federal permit. They cannot get one without announcing their intentions publicly. If they had announced their intentions publicly, there would have been oversight of their land acquisition strategy. She stopped. She said, "They were counting on you to do what they could not do legally. They were going to let your desperation make you the instrument of their plan. I am not saying this to shame you. I am saying this so you can decide whether that is the tool you want to be." She put the key down. Outside, the silence had a different texture now. It was not the silence of a crowd holding still. It was the silence of a crowd thinking. Then someone, she did not know who, she did not recognize the voice, said, somewhere in the middle of the crowd, "I want to see the document." And then another voice, "Give us the document, Alfie." And then the sound of the crowd was no longer a single thing at all. What happened next was not clean or simple or arranged the way confrontations and stories are sometimes arranged. Judd Harrison asked for the estate complaint document. Alfie Sterling said it was in the cruiser. He went to the cruiser and sat in it and picked up his radio and called someone. Through the gap in the barn door that she could see from the tractor seat, Martha watched his profile in the cruiser window. The phone held not to his ear, but at an angle, as if he was trying to speak without being seen to speak. The crowd had not dispersed, but it had reorganized itself. The solid, forward-pointing mass had softened into clusters. Men and women standing in groups of 3 and 5 and 7, talking. She could see Cal Whitmore in one group with his hands moving rapidly, arguing with someone she could not identify. She could see Lou and Ferris standing apart, looking at her phone, and after a moment Lou held the phone up and took a picture of the barn, not of Martha, but of the barn, and then of the crowd, and then she put the phone down and stood with it in her hand looking at the screen. Lou and Ferris had cell signal. That was something. Judd Harrison walked to the cruiser. He knocked on the window. Alfie rolled it down. The exchange between them lasted about 45 seconds, and at the end of it Judd turned away from the cruiser and walked to the center of the nearest cluster of men and said something that Martha could not hear. After that, Alfie Sterling did not come back out of the cruiser. Martha did not unlock the barn. Not yet. She had not survived 64 years on the Nebraska plains by mistaking a change in weather for the end of the storm. She went to the animal. She checked the dressing on the burns. She filled the coffee can with a second portion of silage from the bin. She pulled a bale of straw from the stack in the corner and broke it open and spread it where the animal was standing, giving her something soft under her feet. Her hands were steadier now. She noticed that and was grateful. She heard gravel crunch outside, close, on the south side of the barn. She went to the small window, the one Roy had cut in the barn wall for ventilation, and looked out. Eldon Whitmore was crouched at the corner of the barn, looking at something on the ground. She could not see what. He was not looking at her. After a moment, he straightened and walked back toward the crowd, and she saw that what he had been looking at was the cut water line, her external water supply, which someone had severed in the night or early morning. He had found it, looked at it, and was walking back toward the crowd with his face carrying something that was not quite the expression he had arrived with. The document that Alfie had retrieved, or not retrieved, was apparently becoming the center of gravity of the crowd's attention. She could see it in the body language of the clusters, the way men moved toward or away from the cruiser in groups. The bullhorn stayed silent. At 11:43 in the morning, a vehicle turned off the county road and came up the gravel drive. It was not a police vehicle. It was a white pickup truck with a logo on the door that Martha could not read at this distance. The truck parked at the edge of the crowd, and a woman got out, young, in her 30s, wearing a field jacket and carrying a recorder. A journalist. Martha did not know how or who. The radio transmission, or Lewin's phone, or both. Something had worked. She did not move from the barn. The journalist went to Alfie's cruiser. She knocked on the window. She had a recorder and a calm, professional expression. Alfie rolled the window down a second time. Martha could not hear any of it, but she watched Alfie's face through the glass, and what she saw there was the particular expression of a man who has lost control of the narrative and knows it, and is now deciding how to position himself for what comes after. The storm, she thought. The storm is passing. But she did not unlock the barn. She sat on the upturned feed bucket, in the warm quiet of the barn, with the animal breathing beside her and the sounds of the crowd outside undergoing their slow, uncertain transformation. She sat with her hands in her lap, and she thought about Daniel. She had been thinking about him all morning in the way she always thought about him. At the edges, not head-on. The way you can sometimes look at a very bright light. But now, here, in the still center of everything that was happening, she thought, I have been afraid of a piece of paper for 4 years. I have been afraid of the feeling in my own chest when I see his handwriting. She got up. She went to the small personal cabinet Roy had built into the wall of the barn, the one meant for keeping records and logbooks, but that had become, over the years, a catch-all for the things she carried with her when she worked and did not want to leave in the house. She opened it. The envelope was there. She had put it there sometime in the last year, during one of the periods when she could not stand having it in the house, in the drawer, so close to where she slept. She had brought it here, to the barn, to Roy's space, as if Roy's presence in the wood and the tools and the smell of the place might help her. It was a plain white envelope, the kind you buy at a drugstore. Her name on the front. His handwriting, careful, deliberate, left-handed, the letters built with a precision that had taken him 2 years to develop after the accident at the plant that had cost him the index finger and middle finger of his right hand. She had known that before he died. She had not known before this morning that the accident at the plant had been the first one, not the last. She sat back down on the bucket. She held the envelope. The animal came and stood beside her, not touching her, just beside her, close enough that Martha could feel the warmth of her through the air between them. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded page, the paper worn at the creases from the number of times she had partially unfolded it and refolded it without reading past the first line. She unfolded it fully. She read it. Daniel's handwriting covered both sides of the page. He had written it, from the date at the top, on a Sunday, the day before the accident. He had written it sitting in his apartment, he said, because he had been thinking about her and the farm and could not sleep. He had not written about the farm the way she had feared. He had not written about money or debt or his inability to come home. He had written about the morning she had found him, when he was 9 years old, carrying a sparrow with a broken wing across the yard, trying to make a nest for it in the barn from scraps of an old shirt. She had helped him. She had sat with him. She remembered now. In that same barn, in much the same way she was sitting now, while they waited to see if the bird would live. She did not remember that morning as particularly significant. She remembered it the way you remember many mornings from a long life, softly, incompletely, as texture rather than event. Daniel had written about it for half the page. He had written that it was the moment he understood what strength actually was. Not the strength of getting through things without breaking, but the strength of refusing to stop caring when caring was inconvenient or painful. He had written, "Mama, what made me strong was watching you refuse to let the world change your heart. Every hard year, I looked for that. Every time I felt like giving up, I thought about you sitting on the floor of that barn with a sparrow that might not make it. I never forgot that." He had written, "I am sorry I have not come home sooner. I am going to come home. I have been afraid that if I come home it means I failed, and I know that is wrong. But that is the thing I am working on. I think I am almost there." He had written, at the bottom, "I love you, Mama. The farm is not what matters. You are what matters. Everything good in me, you grew." Martha sat in the barn for a long time. The animal stood beside her. Outside, the crowd had grown quieter, or perhaps it was just that the sound of her own grief had changed its quality and taken up more of the space. She had been carrying the weight of a message she had not read for 4 years. And the message was not the thing she had feared. The message was the thing she had always known, in the part of herself that knew things before they were said. She folded the letter. She put it in her shirt pocket, against her chest. She stood up. She said, quietly, to no one and both of them, "I hear you." She went to the barn door, and, for the first time since dawn, she opened it. The light came in hard and flat, the way late-morning Nebraska light always does, without warmth, just brightness, the color of aluminum. Martha stood in the open door and looked out at what remained of the morning's confrontation. It was Judd Harrison who moved first. He was standing 30 feet away with 3 other men, and when the barn door opened, he straightened and turned and looked at her, and in his face was an expression that had not been there this morning. She could not name it precisely. It was something between shame and exhaustion, and in a man like Judd Harrison, who wore his certainty like armor, it looked wrong on his face, like an expression borrowed from someone else. He said, "The document." He held up a sheet of paper. She walked toward him. She took it. She read it. The estate complaint was filed on behalf of something called Meridian Land Partners, LLC. The signature on behalf of the estate was a name she did not recognize, a legal name, a person who existed somewhere but had no relationship to Oakhaven or the Keller family or anything that should have been filing complaints in this county. She said, "Who is Meridian Land Partners?" Judd said, "We asked Alfie that." She said, and he said, "Alfie is talking to a lawyer right now, in his cruiser. He has not gotten out of the cruiser in 45 minutes. She looked at the reporter, who was standing nearby with her recorder running. She said to the reporter, "The document I am holding was filed in Oakhaven County by a corporate entity with no documented connection to the estate it claims to represent. The animal in this barn bears identification consistent with federally grant-funded research stock. I am prepared to provide a full account on the record." The reporter said, "I am recording." Martha said, "Good." She handed the document back to Judd. He held it in both hands and looked at it, and she watched something work its way through his face, the slow, grinding calculation of a man accounting for what he had been a part of this morning. He said, quietly, "We did not know, Martha. I want you to know that. We did not know the full." She said, "I know, Judd." He said, "We came here because they told us this was the only." She said, "I know. You told me about the ketchup packets. I have not forgotten." He was quiet. He looked at the barn. He said, "What happens now?" She said, "I do not know entirely, but I think that journalist has enough that Alfie is not going to be able to file anything against me today. And I think that without the county sheriff's cooperation, the corporate land strategy has a significant problem." He said, "They will try again." She said, "They will try again. They usually do. But next time you will see them coming." He looked at her for a moment, at her face, her posture, the letter-shaped outline she was not conscious of pressing through her shirt pocket. He said, "How are you not angrier at us?" She considered that honestly. She said, "I have been angrier at myself for longer. It gives you perspective." He looked down at the document. Then he folded it and put it in his back pocket. He said, "What do you need?" By 3 in the afternoon, the county road was quiet again. The trucks and the ATVs and the horses had gone. The reporter had driven away with enough for a story that would, in the coming weeks, connect Meridian Land Partners to a regional agricultural acquisition strategy that had been operating across 4 counties. Alfie Sterling drove away in his cruiser without speaking to anyone, and 2 weeks later he resigned his position citing health reasons, which was what it was and what it was not, simultaneously. What remained, in the late flat light of a Nebraska afternoon at the end of a 3-year drought, was the land and the people and the work. There were 14 men at the south fence line. Cal Whitmore had brought wire stretchers. His brother Eldon had brought a post driver. 2 of the younger men Martha did not know by name had driven to the hardware store in town and come back with a coil of fence wire, which they had paid for themselves, and which they had refused to let Martha discuss when she tried. Judd Harrison had called a man he knew who had worked in agricultural genetics, who agreed to drive out from Lincoln in the morning. The question of what to do about the animal, the regulatory questions, the USDA questions, the questions that would take weeks and lawyers to untangle, was a question for the morning. Today it was enough that the animal was alive, and that the barn was intact, and that the fence was being repaired by the same hands that had torn it down. Martha made coffee. She brought it out in a pot and set it on the tailgate of Cal's truck and said nothing more than that it was there if people wanted it. And people came and poured it into their own cups and said little, because there was not a great deal that needed saying. She stood at the edge of the south pasture in the late afternoon and watched the fence work. The ground here was still cracked and pale. The grass was still the color of ash. Nothing had changed about the land itself. It was still 3 years dry, still damaged, still the particular kind of wounded that takes seasons to heal. But the animal had come out of the barn in the afternoon, while the fence work was going on, and walked slowly to the edge of the yard and stood there with her ears forward and her eyes moving across the horizon. She was still thin. She would be thin for a long time. But she stood. And Martha would not have believed it if she had not felt it on the back of her own hand. The sky shifted. Not dramatically, not cinematically, not the way it happened in movies, where a single shaft of light breaks through a perfect cloud formation. It was the particular gray-green shift that people who have lived on the plains long enough know not by sight, but by feeling. A change in the air pressure, a slight drop in temperature, something moving in from the northwest that was not hot and was not dust. Cal Whitmore looked up from the fence. Eldon looked up. Judd Harrison, standing with a pair of pliers, looked up. Martha looked up. The first drop fell on her right hand. She looked at it for a moment. A small dark circle on her skin, spreading at the edges. She looked up again. The second drop fell on her face. By the time the third and fourth came, the horizon had changed color entirely, and the men at the fence had stopped working and were standing with their faces turned upward in the particular way of people who have been waiting for a very long time and are not yet certain they should believe what is beginning to happen. Rain. A Nebraska rain, slow and serious and without drama. The rain of a region that does not perform its weather, that receives it and absorbs it in silence. The cracked ground began to darken in small spreading circles, each drop finding the earth and disappearing into it immediately, the way the thirsty earth takes everything you give it without showing anything at first. Martha stood with her face up and her eyes closed and the rain on her skin and Daniel's letter in her shirt pocket, and she thought, he came home. He did come home, not the way either of them had planned, but he came home. The animal stood in the field with her ears back and her eyes half closed, letting the rain fall on her damaged hide. And for the first time since Martha had found her, she did not look like a creature on the edge of extinction. She looked like a creature that had survived. The men at the fence did not go back to their work immediately. They stood in the rain for a moment. This group of people who had come here this morning armed and afraid and furious, and had stayed to mend the fences they had broken, and let themselves feel something they had not felt in 3 years. Martha looked at them, at their faces in the rain. She thought about what she had said on the radio that morning, about scarcity hardening the soil. She thought, that part was true. Scarcity does harden the soil. She had watched it harden, year by year, this land and these people. She had watched the cracks form. But what she had not said on the radio, because she had not known it yet, what she understood now, standing in the first rain in 3 years, with a recovered animal in the field and patched fence on the horizon and the letter against her heart, was that hardened soil still remembers how to receive water. The cracks that look like damage are also, sometimes, the places where the rain gets in deepest. She went inside. She made more coffee. She left the door open. The rain came steadily, without apology, into the cracked earth of Oakhaven County. It had no opinion about what had happened that morning. It did not know about corporate strategies or fraudulent estate filings or sheriffs who had made themselves comfortable with the wrong people over too many comfortable years. It did not know about letters or sparrows or the particular kind of strength that looks, from the outside, like stubbornness. It simply fell, the way necessary things fall, without asking permission, on everything at once. The cracked land, the repaired fence, the thin, recovering animal, the people standing in the field with their faces upturned, the old barn where a man's careful handwriting still sat folded against his mother's chest. It fell. If this story reached something in you, if Martha's choice in that dark barn meant something, then you already know why these stories matter. We live in a world that tells us, very consistently, that the small acts do not count. That one bucket of water in a dust storm is just a bucket of water. That kindness without strategy is naivety. That the hardened keep what they have and the soft give it away. Martha Vance would disagree. So would I? If you believe that the small acts still count, that what we do when no one is watching is who we actually are, leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from today. Tell me about the last time you chose to help something that could not repay you. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who faced extraordinary pressure and refused, quietly and without ceremony, to become smaller than they were, subscribe to this channel. Press the bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. We will be back with another story soon. The rain is still falling in Oakhaven. The earth is still drinking.